Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to this live edition of the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. As some of you may know, Arihanta Institute is a nonprofit Jain studies institution that is also dedicated to disseminating information about veganism, vegan-adjacent issues, animal issues, environmental issues, largely through the lens of nonviolence and kind of the betterment of both humans and animals and our environment. And as part of our programming at Arihanta Institute, we have a vegan studies initiative, and I'm a professor at Arihanta Institute, and I'm the lead organizer of this initiative. And for a lot of the podcast episodes, I like to bring in leading scholars, advocates, activists, thinkers, critics who have really important things to say about vegan studies adjacent topics. And so I'm really happy today to have Dr. Laila Kassam from Project Phoenix to help nuance this conversation. So thank you so much, Laila, for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Great. So I'll give a little bit of background on Laila, and then we're just going to dive right in. So Laila is the founder and director of Project Phoenix. As executive director, she leads Project Phoenix's development, strengthening organizational capacity, and guides strategic planning, leadership, and culture to ensure that its impact aligns with its missions and values. As network power lead, she cultivates a national network of organizations and individuals working towards shared goals for animal freedom. Laila is the co-founder and former director of Animal Think Tank, where she served for 6 years. She is co-editor of the book Rethinking Food and Agriculture: New Ways Forward, which envisions a truly just and sustainable food system. She is on the advisory board of Animal Advocacy Careers and the Empathy Project, and a mentor for Kickstarting for Good. She has been involved in social change for most of her career, having previously worked in international development for 15 years. She has a PhD in development economics and a master's in development management. Did I get all that right, Laila?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I started to do my job well from the beginning. So, we have these live editions of the podcast. As some of you may know, we have a running edition of the kind of the regular podcast. But I think it's really great that we do a few of these live video podcasts that also give our audience some time at the end to ask questions directly to you. So before I get into your work specifically and the things that I kind of just like you to talk about, I want to start with a question that I really ask everybody who I speak to. And this is, how did you first get radicalized for animals? And I just want to specify that when I say that, I know a lot of people in vegan and animal movements say, it's not radical, compassion isn't radical, or, animal liberation isn't radical. But, in our society, it is. In the UK, it is. In the US, it is. We'll just talk about where we both are. So how did you first get radicalized for animals?
Well, it depends. Yeah, it depends what you mean by radical. In terms of going vegan, I basically that came through meditation for me. And it wasn't really about animals as such. It was about, actually, it shifted the way that I saw the whole world, including who was on my plate. But then I think in terms of becoming even more radicalized, in terms of thinking about social movements and potentially putting my body and freedom on the line for other animals, I think that came a few years later. And I have to blame a friend of mine, Dan Kidby, for this. He's co-founder of Animal Rebellion, now called Animal Rising in the UK, and also a co-founder of Animal Think Tank, one of the organizations that I've co-founded. And it was really listening to him at a presentation at a Veg Fest talking about the civil rights movement and about the activists who were part of the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins and how, they put their bodies and freedom on the line to really shift culture, shift legislation, and to really fight for their cause. That I think I feel like I woke up during that period in terms of I could do so much more than just be vegan. I could actually, create transformative change working with others, through collective action, through nonviolent civil disobedience. And then I went on to organise with Extinction Rebellion, which was one of the big movements in the UK over the last sort of 5 years. So I would say that's part of my journey of radicalizations.
Great. Yes, I think it's kind of still one of these terms that people like to debate. But I guess what I mean by that is, often how did you come to recognize that animal liberation is a social justice movement that demands the kind of attention such as the civil rights movement or kind of climate movements and so on, which then demands forms of action that one finds in those movements, not just, say, some personal lifestyle change, right? So I think that's exactly kind of a great distinction, kind of where you started to then realizing like, wow, this actually demands a lot more of me.
Yeah, and I would say then, given that definition that you've now sort of distinguished between sort of realizing that it was a social justice movement, and then I think I went to the next stage of like demanding action from me, I would say, obviously reading has been a really, really important part for me of understanding this whole thing of exploiting other animals. And I think one of the books that really, I think, did radicalize me was by David Nibert, Animal Rights, Human Rights, Entanglements of Oppression and Liberation, I think it's called. It's on my shelf just there. But I in reading that, I really fundamentally realized that it wasn't just, we are not going to transform this oppression, this systematic and systemic oppression of other animals through, one-to-one vegan outreach. We need something that can shift the systems of society. And the only thing that I knew of at that time, and still really only thing that I know of now that can do that is people-powered social movements. And I had been, very political, in other areas for decades before going vegan. And I think it was reading that book and others as well that really helped me join the dots. It's like, this is another social justice movement like so many others.
Well, that's great. It's a wonderful link to kind of where I wanted to head next anyway, this notion of people power for animal freedom, right? Which is kind of the title of this episode. So this will be like a kind of a two-part adventure. But the first part is really asking you, like, just from your own vantage point in history, because I don't expect you to be able to kind of like summarize movements that are kind of, maybe outside of your knowledge or your time period, but from your own vantage point, your own personal history, can you just describe what you would say is the current state of the animal movement, as it were, and maybe how it's changed from when you started to where it is now? And whether you want to just describe this in the kind of the setting of the UK, that's fine. Or you can speculate a little broader, but a little bit more broadly. But just how would you describe it at the moment, maybe compared to where it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or so on?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I will limit this to the UK. I don't want to speak outside of my experience. So where are we right now? Okay. Firstly, I think since I went vegan in 2013, veganism has gone quite mainstream in the UK. And I would give a lot of credit to Veganuary for that. It's really sort of shifted the culture and it's become much more normalized to be vegan and to have, vegan menus and chain restaurants and free from and vegan sort of sections in supermarkets. So on some level, it really has become mainstream. I would say this is some kind of form of vegan capitalism, though I wouldn't say that this is a particularly like radical shift, but I do think it's an important cultural shift to normalize veganism. So that's one thing. I would also say that, compared to what I understand the UK was back in the sort of 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where it had like this really vibrant grassroots network of community-led campaigning groups that really powered many of the wins that we've had in the UK, like ending fair farming, ending live exports, cosmetic testing, wild animals in circuses, all of which were, through grassroots campaigning, building the public pressure for then NGOs to come in and to be able to do their lobbying and codifying these wins in Parliament. Like, that doesn't exist anymore. That is not here. That disappeared through like big state repression in the early 2000s for reasons I can go into if you're interested. So I think what's here now is a movement that's quite different to the past. There's a lot of, instead of sort of a lot of direct action, let's say, there's a lot of vegan outreach. I think that's one of the things that sort of replaced that kind of activism, is like there's a lot of street activism focused on vegan outreach, which I think is great, and I think we need a lot more than that. The founding and the sort of the growth of Animal Rebellion and which is now called Animal Rising, I think was an attempt to bring some of that radicalism and direct action back. And I think that was founded in 2019. And I think for 4 years, 4 or 5 years, they really did some amazing direct actions and mobilized people. But I think and got so many, a lot of press, a lot of media, a lot of public conversation about animal issues. But because it wasn't really coming from the lineage of like the animal rights history in the UK, I think it came out of Extinction Rebellion, which has a different DNA. And because it's quite a centralized, small group of people who are sort of leading the actions, it's not been sustainable to sort of have, mass civil disobedience and mass arrests going on and on and on. I think structurally, it would have to be a different structure. So I think there was a big sort of, I don't know what to say, excitement for quite a few years. And now I think, they're sort of consolidating and shifting their strategy. So I think that we're missing, what I'm trying to say is I think we're missing this sort of really radical edge of the movement in terms of the direct action. Obviously, we've got the hunt saboteurs that have been going on for decades. It's a very powerful tradition of direct action. And that's been going on the whole time that other things have come and gone. So that's more the sort of the grassroots space. I think for currently the NGO space, there's I would say a lot of resource and time and effort. And I would say quite a big part of the narrative of the movement in the UK is quite dominated by welfare orientated like campaigns, like cage-free corporate campaigning, the Better Chicken Commitment corporate campaigning. So these sort of incremental reforms. So I think that the movement ecosystem is quite imbalanced because there's a lot going on in terms of welfare, but it's not balanced by a more abolitionist sort of progressive radical ask, because that grassroots space, there's a bit of a vacuum. So I guess there's a sort of high level thing I would say. There's lots of really good stuff going on in the movement. There's been lots of progress in terms of veganism and cultural shift. And, there's a lot of great stuff going on in terms of like greener by default, plant-based by default, plant-based universities, plant-based institutional change. So I would say that cultural norms around food are shifting. But I would say that pushing forward what we really want as a movement, which is freedom for other animals, I'm not sure that there's been a huge amount of progress in that since I started, since I got involved in the movement. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really think that helps a lot, especially understanding the kind of intersection and the challenges or the differences between like hunt saboteurs, what Animal Rising is doing, what Extinction Rebellion was doing, and we'll get to Project Phoenix soon as well. But really understanding these challenges, and they've been going on for a long time. And I feel I was just kind of scribbling down a few things, and sometimes I apologize, it doesn't come out as a question. It's more just me thinking about things, and you can grab onto something and help clarify it for me. But right on the one hand, what we're missing is a kind of radical aspect of the movement, as it were. But on the other hand, you recognize that we need to kind of like normalize the shift. And so you have things like, as you said, like vegan capitalism, vegan capitalistic endeavors, or veganuary, or whatever else. So I guess the question, and it is a question, it ties into my second question, which is in your long study also of theories of social change, like what do you see now as being that relationship between the absolute indispensability of a radical wing while at the same time doing kind of more incremental efforts to normalize, say, if not animal liberation, the kind of pivot in that direction?
Yeah. So I think, so in terms of, thinking about social change and how it happens, I mean, the jury's still out on all of this. But I think one particular sort of theory of change that I really like, because I think it's very holistic and I think it does represent the complexity of, the animal exploitation, as well as like the fact that we're operating in a very complex system, is this idea of looking at movements as ecosystems. And needing various pieces in place, including the incremental change, including the more radical shifts, including personal transformations of veganism, including creating alternatives like, plant-based farming and plant-based alternatives. And I think all of those pieces need to be present, but also connected. And I think that is where the power really comes from in a movement that's both balanced, but also these different pieces and the different people who are involved in these different theories of change are connected, have trusting and good relationships. So even if we don't agree on the particular strategy, we understand each other's theories of change. We don't say that, the grassroots people are just, really emotional and being led by emotion and they're not rational. And we don't say that the NGOs are just complete sellouts. We really can understand each other's perspectives and that all of it's needed. But I think, as I said, the problem that we're facing in the UK movement is that all of these pieces aren't there really, as strong as each other. And I think when you look at sort of social movement theory and look at, Bill Moyer is an activist and social movement theorist, and he has something, he looks at the movement cycle of lots of different social movements. And really, for social movements to take off, you do need that, what he calls the role of the rebel, that can respond to a trigger event and really push the issue out into the public consciousness. So if we don't have a strong rebel role in our social movement, I actually feel like we're not going to take off in the direction that we really need to. And I think the other thing is that we are dealing with a complex problem. It's not a complicated problem. It's not a complicated problem like building a rocket or doing heart surgery, or, which is, difficult but ultimately predictable. And you can have a step-by-step plan, and you can apply expertise, and you can follow a blueprint, and you'll probably get a result that you would expect. This is a complex problem that involves living systems, it involves people, it involves narratives, it involves culture, politics, economics. And cause and effect is not linear. So the same intervention is not going to produce the same outcome. It depends on the context and the timing. And so for us, I think we need all those pieces in place because we don't know what's going to work ultimately. And I think being connected as a movement, as, people with different theories of change, we need to be experimenting, and then successful experiments can then spread. That this is how innovation spreads, and I think that's another thing that we're missing at the moment, is that connection, because otherwise we can't work in synergy. So, and then I suppose just the final thing, because you asked, what's this relationship between the sort of more radical and the more incremental? People often talk about infighting, and I feel that actually we can have creative conflicts, and they can be generative, and I think they can be good for both sides. I think it's when the conflict or the fighting is that sort of poorly managed that then we can call it infighting, and it's a waste of time. But we can play these roles effectively and ineffectively, and I think it's important to be able to debate and critique and offer alternatives. And I think what's really important is if we are connected as individuals, organizations, groups, and have some level of trust, then we can do conflict well, and we can actually, make it generative and productive and move us forward, rather than getting mired in kind of saying, I've got the right way and you're wrong, and, blah, blah, blah.
I think that's a great point because right after all these years, we still don't really know what will work. And what you said earlier is even social change outside of the animal issue, and the animal issue is just so much more entrenched and complicated and contextual and regional and emotional. And we still don't really even know, even in a lot of human justice movements. So I really appreciate that acknowledgement of our ignorance, as it were, or that we're still kind of figuring this out. And I think that's important because you see so many individuals who think that they know the way, which is coincidentally, seemingly the thing that they've aligned themselves with has to be that way. But also what you said about synergy, I think is really important because it is this kind of recognition that a lot of these tools, these tactics have to work in tandem because we're dealing with human beings. And I do think like a good example is the role of like the rebel, right? Or the radical. I think when people see someone who, for whatever reasons, is disposed or has the ability or the privilege to engage in radical action, I think it does inspire people maybe not to do that, but to say like, hey, Layla's doing this. And like, that's pretty intense. I probably couldn't do that. But you know what? I can go help with food not bombs. I can go hand out leaflets. I can do this. I can make phone calls. I can do web design, say, for the local organization. I think it is inspiring. And so I think that role is critical. And then I guess the other point that I was interesting that you mentioned about this balance between radical and, say, incremental is I think that when and maybe you first got involved, it seemed to be either people who were like abolitionists and those that were doing welfare or reform. But I feel like the concept of like non-reformist reform has become a bit more accepted.
Yeah.
And I'm just like curious how you think about that. And if you think that's actually the way in which we can put these two kind of seemingly opposed entities in synergy.
Yeah, I love this non-reformist reform. I think we have to be really careful with the incremental reforms, that those reforms aren't undermining the bigger mission. And I think that's kind of one of the criteria. So I would say that doing, the cage-free or the better chicken commitment, if it's not framed well as like one step to ending factory farming, which is a big milestone on the, on the pathway to ending all exploitation of animals. And obviously we have to be savvy with our messaging. So we might not want to say that publicly always. But I think if it's not framed well, and if it's not done in the context of also trying to shift the narrative, trying to shift people's hearts and minds, I think it can undermine sort of the wider goals. So I think what we really need are sort of these interim goals that are really pushing us forward together rather than potentially undermining the more radical asks. And I think, this issue of greenwashing or humane washing, or what we have started to call in the UK welfare washing, is a really important like example. So if you are doing the sort of more the more welfare oriented type things and sort of giving really, good PR for the industry to, look at how great our welfare is. Like, I do think that's a really harmful narrative, which is stopping people from shifting to veganism and seeing other animals as individuals. So I think that's worthy of disruption. So I've been thinking quite a lot about, okay, so what are the types of reforms that we could, build coalitions around, that, more reformist types and more sort of like progressive or whatever you want to call them could rally around? Well, I think that the single issue bans are actually non-reformist reforms because they're not going the whole way, but they are very much the tradition of the grassroots. And I think that each ban, each focus on a particular industry, you can tell the story about those animals being individuals, and as are so many others. And even focus, there's a big history in the UK movement of focusing on vivisection, going back, hundreds of years, and focusing, for example, there's always been this focus on dogs. That's because that's where the public is. That's where, and if you can talk about the factory farming of dogs for testing on animals, and then you can talk about the factory farming of pigs who are also tested on, but also that we eat because we see them as food. I think there are I would say that these single issue bans framed well can be non-reformist reforms. And then I don't know, I might regret trying to talk about this because it's a bit rusty in my mind, but there's some legal scholarship been done by Eva Kempers and Saskia Stuckey and some legal scholars who talk about transition rather than revolution. So I think when we started out, especially when I started out, I thought, I was following Gary Francione and Stephen Wise, and it's the idea that we get personhood and then all these other things come. And, these sort of legal scholars have talked about the fact that actually women's rights, children's rights, so many social movements and civil rights have come through like getting particular rights or simple rights rather than, the full fundamental rights. And then they sort of add up to become personhood. So I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but so for example, we could reframe a welfare campaign, for example, a campaign around enrichment. Enrichment is an industry term to, the right or the freedom to play. So I guess my point is that we could think about what the types of sort of non-reformist reforms, the types of simple rights, welfare rights that animals actually do have a lot of in the UK because we have slightly better laws. The enforcement is not very good, but on paper that they have these rights, so that we can say, let's expand these rights. So simple rights become fundamental rights over time. Now, I don't know what the strategy is in terms of social movements, but I do think that there's an opportunity to find ways forward that are like, non-reformist reforms. And
it also makes it more legible to the public and kind of understandable, like we're arguing for the personhood of dogs or elephants. It's just this kind of like nebulous idea. But if you're saying like we are fighting for the freedom to elephants to play or to be around their loved ones or to have, this is something I can understand. It's kind of with gay rights, right? Like I can understand you frame it in terms of these like larger rights, it becomes nebulous. But when you frame it in terms of like wanting to marry the person you love or something like this is immediately legible to someone, where it makes it hard for that person to kind of position himself in opposition.
Yeah, this is exactly right. And actually the sort of this idea of the freedom or the right to play came from thinking about the gay rights and how it shifted, the narrative shifted from rights and justice and equality to the freedom to marry. Love is love. You can't really argue with that. And I think we need to find framings and narratives and messages that really get to people's hearts.
Okay, so I would love to actually talk more. I'm just going to, in line with my better judgment, put a pin in non-reformist reform for now, and maybe we'll come to it a little bit later. Because I want to tell our audience, ask questions. I didn't announce this at the beginning of the podcast, but because it's a live version, all of you who are here, please drop your questions in the Q&A box. We'll spend the last 15 to 20 minutes on your questions. But what I would like to do is now pivot to the work at Project Phoenix, because you just ended your last kind of comment by saying we need to change hearts and minds. Like, how do we get to people's hearts and minds? So I'm only assuming that this is part of what Project Phoenix is trying to do. So can you just give us a little bit of background, especially because a lot of our audience is not in the UK, of just what y'all are up to over there?
Yeah. So Project Phoenix is pretty new. We technically really only started in February this year, but we've been thinking about it for over a year. But fundamentally, the idea grew out of this shared realization between me and my two co-founders that if we want to win animal freedom, we can't just keep doing more of the same. And we really need to build a mass movement for animal freedom, something that is people-powered, something that can shift hearts and minds, something that can build the public pressure for legislative change as well. And so our mission is basically to build the power of the UK animal freedom movement into an unstoppable force for change. And we sort of take inspiration from the mythical phoenix because we believe that the UK movement is ready for a resurgence, rising from the ashes of past repression, but more transformed, more strategic and more connected than before. And so what does that look like in practice? Well, we've got three main programs. The first is about rebuilding this grassroots network that I talked about. So we've launched something called the Animal Freedom Network. And this is a network of community-led campaigning groups across the UK. And if we think about the past, I think people have estimated there were 300 of these local groups, and there's currently not very many. So we are finding organisers seeding local groups and supporting them to really become thriving like communities in their own right that can do their own local campaigning, but can also come together for national actions as well. So we've got 14 currently on the map and another 7 in the pipeline. So it's going faster than we thought, because people are hungry for this. They want to do something. They want to do something locally, be part of their community, and be with like-minded and like-hearted people. So that's the first thing, Animal Freedom Network. We're also focusing on mass leadership development, because movements do not scale without leaders. And too often in the past, I think leadership in our movement has been accidental. It's been concentrated in a few people, overly centralized. A lot of the organizations that are out there, it's like you have a centralized organization and you've got chapters of local groups. For us, ours is completely decentralized, because we fundamentally believe that, it's people, ordinary people taking initiative, taking action together that's going to change things. And centrally, we don't know what's going to work. It's like we want to do this sort of mass experimentation and innovation that can spread. And so much of that relies on having, organizers. There are lots of activists, but there's not so many organizers who can really bring people together, be strategic around the types of campaigns that local groups should be doing, be able to deal with, the conflicts and all the rest of it that happen in local groups. So we're doing mass leadership development through doing boot camps. We've got loads of resources on our website. We're going to be starting video training soon, and ultimately, coaching, mentoring, peer networks, that sort of thing. And then the third thing is that we are experimenting with different types of campaigns, because campaigns are really where sort of movement power meets the public and public relevance. And we are thinking about how do we build a mass movement that's broad-based. And really, we're focusing some of our campaigning around sort of gateway campaigns, which, as I mentioned about, dogs used for testing on. This is something that's deeply felt and people are really outraged about. And it's like, let's meet them where they're at. I feel like dogs are the gateway animal. I think that's been historically shown to be the case in the UK. And then get people into a network that's welcoming, where you don't have to be vegan, but, obviously the space of the local group would be vegan. And people can go on their journey and get radicalized for animals in that way. So we are working on banning greyhound racing with Animal Aid, which is an old animal rights charity in the UK that can focus on the lobbying, and another group called Shutdown Campaign. So the three of us are working together on getting a ban for greyhounds racing, which we think we can do in the next few years. We're focusing on MBR Acres, which is a dog breeding factory farm for dogs, basically, for testing on. People may have heard of Camp Beagle. It's a protest camp that's basically grown up around MBR Acres over I think it's been there for nearly 4 years now. And, so many people are outraged by the fact that we are factory farming dogs. So again, this is another gateway kind of campaign. And then another campaign that we are going to be launching soon, or relaunching, is a campaign against the RSPCA Assured scheme, which is, one of these welfare schemes that I talked about earlier, that's basically welfare washing factory farming fundamentally. So those are the 3 things that we're focused on. And I think the theory of change really that underpins Project Phoenix is that if we want to win, we need to build power. And to do that, we need to build people power. So that's, a mass base of grassroots activists and public support. We need to build network power. So that's connections and trust between groups, NGOs, allies, individuals. And really, we want the grassroots and the grass tops to be working in synergy and trusting each other. We need to build narrative power. This is the thing that's going to shift hearts and minds. It's going to, change the cultural story about fellow animals from, objects and commodities to individuals, someone, not something. And then we need to build institutional power. So to be able to set the agenda and influence policy and law, we wouldn't necessarily be able to do that ourselves, but in collaboration with others who are sort of in those sort of rooms of power and who have got experience with lobbying. I think the public pressure that can build through grassroots organizing can then enable, the inside game to do their institutional kind of work. So yeah, so that's the plan, big plans. But yeah, it's started off very well.
Thank you so much for explaining that for us, especially those not in the UK, and really looking forward to what comes out of all of this this great planning. And you have a wonderful team. I've kind of spent some time looking at your teammates, and yeah, it looks great. And I really appreciate what you said of not only trying to connect people together, but really like engaging with people psychologically as they are, like creating narratives, creating the fact that like, yes, if you lobby for dogs, it's not necessary that then you then say the farming of other animals is okay, right? And I think this was the critique long ago, that if you isolate single issue campaigns, supposedly, right? This is something that even Francine used to criticize years ago, but it's actually not the case just because you have a single issue. What's important is the narrative attached to it. If you're actually saying that dogs matter more, that's why we're fighting for them, then that's a problem. And that's not going to the same horizon. That means we're actually not sharing an animal liberation horizon. That's just like a dog liberation horizon. But if you change the narrative, meet people where they are, and actually say, you agree with this, individuals who already care about dogs. So we're going to frame it that way. And then we'll have another campaign a little bit later that will use the same kind of language, the same kind of narrative, and show how it also applies to, say, cats or guinea pigs or mink or pigs and so on.
Yeah, that is exactly it. And as you said, like we've got an amazing team. So we've got a narrative expert, Natalie Brain, who's one of the co-founders. So this is totally her jam. And this is, she's been doing lots of research over the last few years on the most persuasive narratives that are going to move people. And then also Tom Harris, who is one of the coordinators of the SHAC campaign, Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, that was one of the most dynamic animal rights campaigns, I think, in UK history, if not globally. So we've got a bit of a dream team of like different expertise that can all really match on to the different types of power that we need to build.
Great. Yeah, that just sounds wonderful. And I really think we have a good, solid core team together. And I really appreciate the focus on bridging through narrative, bridging through non-reformist reform, and connecting, as you said, grass tops and grassroots. I really love that image as well. So let me go to some of the Q&A. There's a couple questions here, and then I can always pivot back to my own. So from Christopher Miller, one of our other professors actually at Arihanta Institute. Thank you for a wonderful conversation today. What advice would you give to advocates and activists who are routinely told that veganism doesn't matter because social justice is more important? Are there some particularly effective talking points that you can recommend that connect together much of what you have shared in the podcast episode to demonstrate that they are inseparable, meaning veganism and social justice, and also to communicate that being vegan doesn't mean that vegans don't care about social justice?
Well, the first thing that came to mind with Christopher Sebastian saying, I can chew gum and walk at the same time. So yeah, exactly. With the last point, it's like, just because you're vegan, it doesn't mean that you don't care about other social justice issues. And I would say, I don't know about effective talking points, because it's not like I've ever managed to get through to social justice folks around this. But I do think that this entanglement of human oppression, animal oppression, and our destruction of the natural world is the basis on which, like, I think that some persuasive arguments could be built. It is only through the fact that we can oppress, people who end up in slaughterhouse workers, that we can end up killing other animals because of the lack of opportunity, because of migrants, undocumented people who end up doing these horrible jobs. It's this is just one of many entanglements. And I think we have to, and maybe it's about meeting people where they are again. So if you're talking to somebody who is a feminist but hasn't quite joined the dots between the fact that we basically milk and so much of the so-called food and that we eat is based on taking over somebody else's reproductive system and this kind of reproductive violence. Like, I think those types of connections, I would imagine, are quite powerful. I definitely know Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat has really showed a lot of people this entanglement between different oppressions. Am I understanding the question correctly?
No, I think you are. I think, and maybe to help
Yes.
roll it along as well as, and I don't know if you agree or disagree, as I used to years ago kind of like ask people or ask myself and then others, like, are you interested in vegan advocacy or animal advocacy? Because I used to think that they're kind of separate, they are separate issues, right? Am I trying to move someone towards veganism? Because if that's the case, I could point out, say, a lot of the issues with the industrial slaughterhouse that have nothing to do with animals, right?
Yeah.
PTSD, addiction,
Yeah.
exploitation,
Yeah.
domestic violence,
Yeah.
pollution, and so on, right? And find all of these ways that actually are not animal centric that have to do with why you should not support slaughterhouses. So I'm meeting you where you are because you're already concerned with human justice issues, and I'm going to my goal is to get you to change your habits. So I'm going to appeal to those issues. I used to think that, you know, at least in a categorical form, this is kind of vegan advocacy. I'm trying to get you to change your habits based on the thing you already care about. I'm not really trying to get you to change what you care about.
Yeah.
And I used to envision animal advocacy as ways actually now it's more of the harder lift of getting you to change what you think you should care about, at least in a political sense. Because most people, right, care about animals, their dogs and cats. They won't really kind of could inflict harm on them. But in terms of a kind of a political care, you actually had to do that kind of work. So I don't know. I'm curious if that was years ago. I don't know how much I've actually spoken about recently, but if that helps understand the kind of talking points you want to use. Are they vegan talking points or are they kind of animal talking points?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think that's a useful distinction?
I think partly. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, there's maybe a couple of ways to do this. It's like talking about all the harms of, animal, the way that we exploit animals and how they impact human and environmental issues. So that's kind of like what you're talking about, slaughterhouse, PTSD, violence, and communities, etc. And then there's, I guess, another angle of showing how entangled that they all are. And I suppose it's kind of two sides of the same coin. Yeah. And I do think I can see on some level why sort of social justice, like people are like, veganism in the mainstream veganism doesn't feel very radical to people because it does, this sort of vegan capitalism. So I suppose there's also different types of veganism that I think people could be like arguing against. Like, are you a consumer vegan or a boycott vegan or a political vegan? And I think that if we can frame ourselves more as sort of political vegans, I think that can bridge this gap that I think people see between sort of, people who are like, I'm vegan and it's all about food.
Yeah, I mean, it's also right, like you said, it's challenging, right? Because on the one hand, this is kind of come back to our earlier question, and then I'll pivot to another question from our audience. But like on the one hand, you're trying to really foreground this kind of radicalization and the need to see animals as part of social justice movements, right? But then we also know that people are more willing to change their perspectives the more that their habits already align with what those perspectives might demand.
Yeah.
Right. And so all of these reasons, even politically oriented reasons why someone should not say support factory farms could have nothing to do with animals. And then the point is actually after they're already not now buying from factory farms, now you can talk about animals. And it's great because actually if they adopt that politic, they've already done the lift or most of the lift already. So it's interesting to know, right? And this is what I think a lot of norm shifting, maybe even vegan capitalists think we need to do. But I think, as you said, the jury's kind of still out on a lot of this. So let me pivot to some questions here. So another member of our audience, Iris, asks, what would you recommend for a very small animal rights organization which only accepts vegan activists to participate in their street activism? Could this also be improved in a way to somehow be open also for non-vegans? With what justification could this change be made? That is to allow kind of non-vegans to participate in street activism.
Well, so, I mean, I think if you are doing vegan outreach as your street activism, I think it probably doesn't make sense to have non-vegans be doing that outreach because that's not I don't think anybody would want to do that for a start. But if you are a broader animal rights organization that's looking at doing something more than, when I hear street activism, I think about vegan outreach, but maybe you mean, broader things. Then I think everything I said about Project Phoenix applies in terms of if we want to build a base of people who, and a mass movement ultimately, it's going to be made up of both vegans and non-vegans. Because if we just wait for, veganism to grow, it seems to have stagnated in lots of places. Like if we are just focused on vegans doing outreach or vegans doing activism, I don't think that we're going to be able to get to the big shift that we all want. And historically in the UK, for example, like so many people have told me that, oh, I used to be a hunt sab, but they weren't vegan. So it's like, people do activism on behalf of animals, whether, a lot of them when they're not vegan, but then they will end up going vegan. So I think if we really want to shift hearts and minds, if we really want to build our movement and recruit people, I think we have to find ways to bring non-vegans in. So I would say for this animal rights, the small animal rights group, maybe it's a case of broadening the types of things and activism that you do and the things that feel aligned with being able to bring in non-vegans, but who care about a particular issue, whether it's blocking a factory farm planning application or, testing on dogs or, I think, I think that would be my answer.
No, I think that's a good answer. And, sometimes I like to think of other social justice movements and how they don't do any of this. Like I've never been to a movement for other organizing, and at the door, they're like, here's a list of companies. Do you boycott all of these companies? Do you not purchase any of their products? Because if you don't, then you have to go home and get them all out of your house. Yeah. Don't ever buy them. And then you're welcome to come in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. This just doesn't exist in any other movement.
It's exactly. It is such a high bar for people to meet in order to get active for animals. And I think we need to be lowering that bar as much as possible without compromising on our principles.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think when you and I first met in the Bay Area years ago, I think that's where we first met, correct?
Yeah, correct.
It wasn't, I think I saw you in Toronto at some other point. But anyway, in the Bay Area, I was having a conversation, I won't name this activist at the time, who was just joking and using the analogy of environmentalists and just being like, imagine if all environmentalist groups wouldn't let you come to the meeting if you got there in a gas powered vehicle, or if you would travel. It's just becomes oddly, I mean, people use the term this kind of purity kind of test. Yeah. Which has been one of the largest maybe critiques of vegans and why they are, as research has shown, one of the most kind of despised social groups by and large. And so, but even internally, if we're not even talking about how they're viewed externally, yes, I think I agree with what you said. And hopefully this helps our audience member where if you're an animal rights group, if that's your message, then I don't know, it seems, or animal liberation, animal freedom, it seems odd to kind of vet so hard. And especially, how is that going to help that person, right? It's not going to bring them any closer.
Yeah. We have to believe that people can transform, otherwise we're screwed. Basically, we might as well all just stop. Yeah.
Great. The same person asked, is there a chance to spread Project Phoenix over to Switzerland, for example?
Oh, well, everything that would if you or anybody in Switzerland who would want to start doing this type of thing in Switzerland, reach out to us, because there's actually we're focused on the UK, but everything we're doing is kind of open. Our resources are you can just download them off the website. Our strategy is pretty much there on the website, and we'd be very happy to chat. We've talked to people in New Zealand who want to get their grassroots stuff going again, people from Belgium, Italy. So I think I think there is a hunger for this in lots of different places, and we're a team of basically 2.5 people. So I think we just have to focus on the UK at the moment. But yeah, if it's of interest, please reach out. Yeah, it's Laila at project-phoenix.org.uk, or you can just contact us on the website.
Great. I will try to drop that email in as well, but I also did list the Project Phoenix website, so folks can just go there and reach out.
Right.
So I think we might have time for one more question. This comes from Diana. Is there a published timeline of the animal liberation movement that can help activists keep in mind that change happens both radically and incrementally? What challenges, and this is, I guess, looks like a separate question, but related, what challenges are unique to this movement that we don't see in other social justice movements?
Yeah.
Those are
Okay.
2 big questions you just got.
2 big questions in about 3 minutes. Okay, published timeline. Okay, so on the Project Phoenix website, there is a timeline of the UK animal rights movement, but that is very, I would say, grassroots, sort of leaning towards what like grassroots stuff. But that's the only thing that comes to mind at the moment. In terms of challenges, I mean, I think the obvious one is that we're an ally movement. So many of the social justice movements that we learn from were not ally movements. You know, they were fighting for their own rights and their own freedom. So I think this brings challenges, especially in terms of being able to say, well, if I was a pig in a factory farm, I would want X, Y, and Z. I mean, we can use that to support any of our arguments. We don't have the actual, like obviously animals can communicate and we don't hear them, but like they can't tell us fundamentally what we should be doing. Whereas in other social movements, ideally they should be led and be centering the oppressed group. And then also I think, I don't know whether you agree, Jonathan, but I do feel that the exploitation of animals, and it is so embedded throughout all of society in terms of so many industries are built on it, the profit motive, as well as culturally, like it's so entrenched, and there are so many different industries that I do think that it's potentially more complex. Not to diminish any of these other social justice movements, but I do think that we're contending with an infrastructure that is, it's really even bigger than others. But I don't know if that's a controversial thing to say or not. What else? I think those are the 2 main ones. I think definitely the ally movement one feels.
No, I think that's a great way. It even helps me think about it in terms of answering that question, because the ally movement aspect is key. I mean, sometimes I think we look at children's liberation movements or disability movements and say, but those individuals still have their own, can have their own spokespeople, or even the parents of children are kind of so closely connected. Whereas this is such a purely ally movement. And I mean, I used to think years ago, what do we have to have? Like a factory farm chicken storm the stage and grab the microphone, right? Because whenever an activist does something like this, there's critique of it, right? For various perspectives. But when we see people from within the marginalized group kind of asserting themselves to take microphones or have a stage, we realize the necessity of kind of ceding that ground to them and allowing them to speak. But the problem is, what is it when animal rights activists do that? And then we could have a longer conversation of which animal rights activists. So are these kind of like white men who are trying, then, okay, now we have a whole other issue.
Yeah.
So I think that's the case in your first point. And secondly, I would just say, not only is it so embedded materially and kind of institutionally and economically, but in my background is more in kind of philosophy and so on. And I would just think psychologically, it's so embedded, right? We understand humanity vis-a-vis animals.
Yeah.
Whether we're looking from Aristotle to ancient Indian philosophy about kind of political animals, ritual animals, rational animals, ritualistic animals, everything is this kind of distinction, this exceptionalism. Yeah. And so and which then obviously authorizes violence, has authorized violence as a result. And I think our identity is so wrapped up in differentiating from animals, so that the kind of psychological component, ideological component also.
Yeah. No,
I wouldn't say this is completely distinct from all social justice movements, because of course there are others that have kind of this notion of the proper human and the kind of the superior human, but kind of that human-animal binary is so embedded.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say something.
I was, but then I looked at the time. We've got 1 minute.
It's okay. I would prefer you to be the last one to speak, not me.
Oh, well, I just wanted to give a plug to one of my favorite books, An Unnatural Order by Jim Mason, that really goes into this sort of how our oppression of other animals and speciesism is so embedded in our psyche and our culture, and how far back it goes. So I would really recommend reading that, because it blew my mind when I read it.
Great. So some really great plugs so far. Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat, David Nybert's Animal Rights, Human Rights, also Animal Oppression, Human Violence is a great text by Nybert.
Yeah.
especially for those who are very concerned about the consequences for humans of domestication and, say, even the industrial exploitation of animals, and now Jim Mason. So we're upon the hour. I just want to thank you so much, Laila, for being here. It's always such a pleasure speaking with you, just personally, but I learned so much, and I always walk away uncharacteristically optimistic and inspired. And maybe I shouldn't say that, but just like uncharacteristically thinking that actually, despite some setbacks and stagnation and the state of the world, we can still see progress. We can still change. And like you said earlier, we have to believe in the ability of transformation of both individuals and movements.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. I think this is a good day for me if you feel a little bit inspired and optimistic. I know you're not generally like that. So thank you. It's always such a pleasure for me to talk to you. I could talk to you for hours.
Wonderful. And thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate you all coming in for the live version of the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. So lastly, again, Laila, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Jonathan.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum, spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more, can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.